They told you the world you touch, see, and hear is the ultimate truth. And what if I tell you that Neville Goddard declared consciousness itself is the only true reality, hidden behind the veil of appearances? This is how it unfolds. Because in those first shocking lessons, Neville whispered that what you assume inwardly determines what crystallizes outwardly. And I will reveal how this single shift can turn your life upside down. This is where the illusion deepens, for the senses keep insisting that what is already formed is final, while Neville insisted the invisible imagination is more real than any stone or steel. This is why it matters, because once you grasp that consciousness is the root, you stop bowing to circumstances and start ruling from the unseen. This is the turning point where the idea of cause and effect collapses, and you realize cause begins in thought and assumption, not in the outside world. This is how the stage is set, with the physical world demoted to a shadow show and your inner world elevated to the throne of creation. This is where the challenge arises, because believing in the invisible requires courage, persistence, and faith stronger than the evidence of your eyes. This is how the illusion seduces you, convincing you that what you see is all there is, while Neville thundered that the seen is temporary, but the unseen eternal. This is why Neville shocked his audience, daring to say that your imagination is God in action, not a daydream, but the very force of creation itself. This is how freedom announces itself, when you suddenly grasp that you are not a victim of chance, but the dreamer shaping every detail of your reality. This is where responsibility begins, for if consciousness is the only reality, then what unfolds around you is nothing but a mirror of what you have assumed within. This is why the idea feels dangerous, because it strips away every excuse and throws you into the role of author rather than actor. This is how destiny is rewritten, when you learn to persist in the assumption of your desired end, refusing to be moved by contradictory facts. This is where Neville's brilliance shines, because he did not merely theorize but gave methods. Assume the wish fulfilled, live in the end, revise the past. This is why his words still burn, for they touch that hidden knowing inside you that whispers the world is not as solid as it seems. This is how the curtain lifts, revealing life itself as a play staged by consciousness, with imagination as both director and actor. This is where you awaken to the truth that every scene you call reality is birthed in the invisible workshop of mind. This is why it feels both terrifying and liberating, because to accept consciousness as the only reality means the keys of heaven and hell are in your own hands. This is how the story begins, with Neville's daring voice echoing across time, asking you to look not at appearances, but at the unseen creative force within. This is where the journey starts, as you step into his vision and ask yourself the question: is consciousness the true reality? And if so, what new world will you dare to create? Can you imagine standing in an audience where Neville Goddard calmly declares that the world you call real is nothing more than a projection of your inner state, a shadow play on the screen of consciousness? This is how it strikes the heart, for his words cut against everything society teaches, telling you that your imagination is not fiction, but the very substance of existence. This is where the shock ripples, because the claim that consciousness alone is real makes the material universe seem like a mirage you've mistaken for permanence. This is how the veil tears, as you realize that everything you admire, fear, or resist outside is born first inside your own invisible awareness. This is why his teaching feels like heresy, because to say consciousness is the only reality is to dethrone the world and enthrone the mind. This is how the reversal begins, shifting power from circumstances and placing it back in your hands, declaring you are not a servant of events, but their author. This is where Neville's courage glows, for he spoke these truths in a world bound to the worship of facts, science, and external authority. This is why the claim unsettles, for if true, it means no one else is truly to blame for your conditions, because life is consciousness pushed out. This is how the inner revolution ignites, when you start to wonder whether your secret fears and hidden assumptions have already shaped the life you now walk through. This is where the horizon widens, for Neville insists you can step into a new state, and from there, the world must rearrange itself to match your assumption. This is why he stands apart, because his words are not philosophy but instruction, a manual for shaping reality from the inside. This is how freedom seduces, whispering that nothing outside has independent power, for everything bows to the law of assumption. This is where the radical claim pierces, as you face the possibility that you are not discovering reality but creating it in every moment. This is why resistance arises, for the ego clings to the safety of blaming fate, chance, or circumstance. This is how Neville's vision expands, showing that the greatest truth has always been hidden in plain sight. That consciousness itself is the foundation of all worlds. This is where the fear dissolves, when you grasp that you have always been the creator, even when you created unconsciously. This is why the words echo across time, because they touch a chord in every soul that secretly knows the dreamer is greater than the dream. This is how the claim transforms from theory into practice, as you dare to test it by assuming your wish fulfilled and watching reality bend. This is where Neville invites you deeper into the mystery of imagination as God, urging you to see beyond appearances into the living root of creation. This is why this section closes with urgency, for if the radical claim is true, then consciousness is the real power, and you are already wielding it whether you know it or not. Picture for a moment the weight of a stone in your hand, the solidity of steel under your touch, and then imagine Neville Goddard whispering that all of it is nothing more than crystallized imagination given form by consciousness. This is how the illusion cracks, when you realize that matter is not a cause but a frozen effect, a delayed shadow of what once lived in thought. This is where the deception deepens, because the senses swear that the outside world exists independent of you, while Neville insists it has no life apart from the mind that beholds it. This is how the truth dawns, as you begin to see that the realness of matter is simply imagination hardened into visibility. This is why Neville's voice was so unsettling, for he spoke as if the material universe were plastic clay in the hands of your inner vision. This is how the prison bars dissolve, when you realize the world is not a wall trapping you, but a mirror reflecting what you secretly assume. This is where liberation whispers, because if matter is only the echo of thought, then changing thought changes the entire landscape of life. This is how the illusion resists, clinging to you through habit and fear, urging you to keep believing that what you see is fixed. This is why courage is demanded, because only the brave dare to deny the evidence of their senses and trust the unseen imagination within. This is how Neville framed it, saying your imagination is not a shadow of reality, but the womb that births reality itself. This is where the alchemy unfolds, for the moment you assume a new inner state, the outer world must bend to accommodate it. This is how the dreamlike nature of matter reveals itself, reminding you that what seems unshakable today may vanish tomorrow with a single shift of consciousness. This is why Neville pressed his students, urging them not to worship facts but to use imagination as the higher law. This is how the battle is fought, not with resistance against matter, but with inner persistence in the assumption of the wish fulfilled. This is where new vision emerges, because as the illusion of matter breaks, the power of consciousness shines as the only enduring reality. This is how despair dissolves, for once you grasp this truth, no obstacle can terrify you the way it once did. This is why the teaching feels both mystical and practical, because it tells you not only what the universe is but how to shape it deliberately. This is how Neville leads you deeper, away from the worship of appearances and into the mastery of imagination as God in action. This is where the secret sharpens, because to break the illusion of matter is to step into your true role as creator. This is why the invitation now grows stronger. For once the illusion falls, the stage is clear for you to write the world you truly desire to live in. Now consider this. Neville Goddard declared that imagination is not a toy of the mind, not idle daydreaming, but the creative power of God Himself moving through you in silence. This is how the revelation pierces, because suddenly every mental picture, every inner dialogue, every unseen assumption is charged with divine potency. This is where the mystery intensifies, for Neville insisted that imagination is the cause of all creation, both the heavens you admire and the struggles you lament. This is how the truth overturns the ordinary, because what most dismiss as fantasy is, in Neville's vision, the workshop of reality itself. This is why the teaching ignites, reminding you that you already use imagination constantly, only without awareness of its infinite authority. This is how the responsibility sharpens, because if imagination creates reality, then careless fear and secret doubt also take form as the shadows you call life. This is where the empowerment awakens. For Neville's instruction was not to suppress imagination, but to discipline it, guiding it into the assumption of what you desire. This is how the vision widens, as you realize imagination is not passive, but active, alive, and endlessly shaping. This is why Neville described God as your own wonderful human imagination, collapsing the distance between divinity and the self. This is how freedom sings, because to know imagination is God is to know you are never separated from the source of creation. This is where the artistry emerges, urging you to live not as a passive observer, but as a sculptor, carving reality through deliberate inner vision. This is how Neville gave practice, commanding his students to imagine themselves into the state desired until it felt natural and real. This is why the teaching electrifies, for it declares that reality does not bow to effort or struggle, but to the quiet, persistent work of imagination. This is how miracles become ordinary, when you realize that what you imagine with conviction must clothe itself in facts. This is where Neville's confidence shocks, because he spoke as one who tested imagination and found it faithful in every trial. This is how the ordinary mind rebels, scoffing that imagination cannot move mountains, yet Neville urged, "Try it and see." This is why the invitation endures, because it calls you to use the very power you already wield unconsciously and make it conscious. This is how the bridge forms, connecting the unseen thought with the seen reality, a bridge that no outside power can sever. This is where Neville's role as a teacher blazes, reminding you that imagination is the law and the world is its servant. This is how the chapter closes, with imagination enthroned as the core of consciousness, urging you to awaken and create deliberately from the only true source of reality. Suppose you discover that the life you walk through each day is nothing but a mirror of what has already been assumed within. A stage play where the script was written in your own inner world long before the curtain ever rose. This is how Neville Goddard declared the law, teaching that nothing appears in the outer world unless it first exists as a state of consciousness within you. This is where the inversion stuns, because society insists that external facts determine inner moods, while Neville reversed the order and said moods shape facts. This is how the power shifts. For once you know the inner comes first, you stop begging circumstances to change and start commanding them from within. This is why the teaching unsettles, because it demands you abandon excuses and accept that your inner assumptions are the true architects of your fate. This is how the stage deepens, as Neville pointed out that even so-called chance meetings, sudden opportunities, and devastating losses are simply reflections of inner states. This is where the light cracks through, because instead of being at the mercy of events, you realize you are the unseen cause of events. This is how the mind resists, clinging to the comfort of believing the world is happening to you, not through you. This is why Neville urged his students to watch their inner conversations, because these unseen dialogues are the seeds of tomorrow's facts. This is how the principle unfolds, showing that to change life, you must not wrestle with conditions but assume a new state and let it outpicture itself naturally. This is where responsibility takes root, for the blame and praise both return to the self, leaving no one else to credit or condemn. This is how the inner authority grows, as you understand that the true battlefield is not in the streets of the world, but in the quiet chamber of the mind. This is why the concept feels both mystical and mathematical, because it operates with exact precision, inner first, outer second, always. This is how the veil lifts, revealing the simplicity hidden beneath the chaos, that life is nothing but consciousness unfolding. This is where Neville's voice rings clear, commanding you to imagine the end and persist, for the end held within will summon its outer likeness unfailingly. This is how the outer world becomes less intimidating because you see it only as an echo, never as the cause. This is why persistence matters, because a wavering inner state produces a wavering world, while steady assumption shapes reality with iron certainty. This is how Neville dismantles victimhood, replacing it with mastery, as he shows you that every scene begins in imagination. This is where the challenge becomes the gift, because even hardship points you back to the inner state that birthed it, urging you to revise and reimagine. This is how this truth settles, declaring with finality that the inner world is first, the outer world is second, and nothing can ever reverse that order. Envision a world where faith is not blind belief in some distant power, but the unwavering persistence of imagination, holding to its vision until it hardens into fact. This is how Neville Goddard reframed faith, not as a ritual of religion, but as the steady inner certainty that what you have assumed is already real. This is where the power glows, because faith becomes the muscle of imagination, exercised not in churches, but in the silence of your own mind. This is how the resistance fades, for when you understand faith as persistence, you no longer struggle to believe. You practice holding the state until it feels natural. This is why Neville emphasized living in the end, because to persist in the wish fulfilled is to clothe faith in action. This is how the invisible works, silently and without drama, as your inner conviction reshapes the outer world step by step. This is where doubt attempts to intrude, whispering that the evidence outside denies your assumption, yet faith replies by resting in the unseen. This is how the discipline sharpens, because faith requires patience, consistency, and a refusal to let appearances shake your conviction. This is why Neville described faith as loyalty to the unseen reality, for to waver is to abandon the seed before it bears fruit. This is how the inner story becomes dominant, as you learn to give more weight to what you imagine than to what you see. This is where transformation becomes inevitable, because steady persistence in imagination builds a momentum no circumstance can resist. This is how the law proves itself, for when the outer world bends to the inner assumption, faith is no longer theory but demonstration. This is why Neville's message was practical, urging his students to test faith, not merely discuss it. This is how the impossible begins to dissolve, for what seems unreachable outside is already accomplished within when faith persists. This is where courage is born, because holding faith and imagination is often a lonely road, unseen by others but rewarded by results. This is how Neville stripped away superstition, showing faith as a creative law rather than a mystical accident. This is why the teaching resonates, because it gives back the power you thought belonged to fate or fortune. This is how faith becomes freedom, as you realize persistence in imagination is the only requirement for change. This is where Neville's brilliance crystallizes, for he turned faith from abstraction into the method of creation. This is how the story of faith closes here, reminding you that every great shift in life is nothing more than the persistence of imagination until the unseen becomes the seen. Think of the moment when every circumstance around you, every door that opens, every obstacle that blocks, every encounter you have, was first born in the fertile soil of your own consciousness, waiting only for recognition. This is how Neville Goddard reveals the ultimate reversal, that what you call conditions are effects, never causes, reflections of the inner state you maintain. This is where the outer world loses authority, because once you see conditions as mirrors, you stop giving them power over your emotions or decisions. This is how mastery begins. For the moment you accept that reality bends to your consciousness, you step into a role far greater than you ever imagined. This is why Neville insisted that changing your inner state is not optional, but essential, because no change in environment will succeed without first altering the mind. This is how the subtle currents move, as thoughts and assumptions silently attract events, molding facts in accordance with their invisible blueprint. This is where clarity sharpens, because it becomes evident that effort expended outside without inner alignment is wasted energy chasing shadows. This is how the law asserts itself, quietly and inexorably, shaping life to match the prevailing consciousness, no matter how small or unnoticed. This is why persistence matters, because a single, consistent state of assumption exerts more power than years of external struggle. This is how transformation sneaks in. For as consciousness shifts, circumstances begin to reconfigure themselves naturally, almost miraculously. This is where doubt trembles, because reality now responds not to past habits, but to the present state held with certainty. This is how Neville's teaching feels revolutionary, because it removes reliance on chance, timing, and other people, placing full creative authority inside yourself. This is why attention is sacred, for what you observe, imagine, and feel most deeply shapes the template of your external world. This is how the unseen hand moves, translating invisible assumption into visible fact without fanfare or announcement. This is where empowerment grows, because once you know conditions follow consciousness, no circumstance can intimidate or dominate you. This is how the invisible hierarchy is revealed, with thought above action, assumption above consequence, mind above matter. This is why change becomes elegant, because inner alignment produces outer miracles with less struggle and more grace. This is how the law manifests, consistent and impartial, bending everything toward the state you maintain with clarity. This is where Neville's wisdom crystallizes, showing that you are not at the mercy of life, but its architect through consciousness. This is how the world opens, revealing that conditions are not walls to smash but mirrors to perfect. Reflections awaiting your inner mastery. Ask yourself, what happens when you wake from a vivid dream, noticing how the world you believed so real moments ago vanishes into nothing, leaving only memory and awareness. Neville Goddard insisted life itself operates in a similar way. This is how the analogy strikes, because he suggested that the reality you inhabit is no more solid than last night's dreams, shaped entirely by imagination and assumption. This is where perception trembles, as you begin to see the waking world not as ultimate, but as a stage projected by consciousness. This is how the truth unsettles, for the permanence of objects, events, and people is revealed to be provisional, contingent upon the state of the mind observing them. This is why Neville used the dream metaphor, because it bridges the gap between the mystical and the practical, showing how inner states dictate the scenes you experience. This is how clarity dawns, as the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and the invisible mechanisms of creation begin to reveal themselves. This is where empowerment surges, because understanding life as a dream implies you are the dreamer, capable of rewriting the plot at will. This is how disbelief falters, since experiments in imagination immediately prove that changing your inner world shifts outer circumstances. This is why the metaphor resonates, for it reframes struggle and limitation as illusions projected from unobserved assumptions. This is how the law of consciousness asserts itself, showing that every event is a reflection, every encounter a correspondence to inner thought. This is where revision gains power, because if the past is part of the dream, it can be revisited, rewritten, and reshaped in imagination to alter your present. This is how miracles appear ordinary, as life bends to match the dreamer's consistent inner state. This is why the waking world begins to feel pliable, like clay in the hands of an awakened mind, awaiting design. This is how freedom is felt, when you realize you need no external permission to shift reality, only deliberate imagination. This is where courage solidifies, because the dream analogy exposes the futility of fear and worry. They are nothing but misperceived projections. This is how the lesson deepens, urging you to persist in the state of your wish fulfilled, as the dream will obey the holder of its story. This is why Neville's students reported astonishing transformations, from financial abundance to healed relationships, all through disciplined inner work. This is how consciousness proves itself the true architect, rendering the material world a reflection, a mirror, a stage for the inner script. This is where the curtain rises on awareness, showing you are both actor and director of the unfolding dream. This is how the journey intensifies, moving from understanding the dream to mastering it, bending every scene to align with your chosen assumption. Consider the possibility that every memory you carry, every regret or disappointment, is not fixed in stone, but a canvas you can repaint with imagination. And Neville Goddard called this process revision. This is how the technique astonishes, because by mentally reimagining past events as you wished they had occurred, you begin to alter their influence on your present reality. This is where the method becomes undeniable. For countless students reported tangible changes in circumstances after faithfully revising memories that once caused pain or limitation. This is how the evidence mounts, as relationships heal, opportunities appear, and inner peace replaces past anxiety, all from a simple but deliberate inner act. This is why Neville emphasized faith and persistence, because the revision must be thorough, lived in imagination until it feels real, before its outer reflection solidifies. This is how mastery manifests, showing that the past is not a prison, but a tool, a set of scenes to be reshaped to serve your conscious desires. This is where responsibility sharpens, because if revision works, you are no longer a passive observer of history, but an active shaper of its impact. This is how transformation becomes personal, as the power of consciousness moves from abstract law into concrete, lived experience. This is why the skeptics stumble, for the mind's unseen hand is subtle, and proof requires patience and attentive observation. This is how Neville framed it, demonstrating that imagination, when applied systematically, is a law more powerful than any external authority. This is where the miracle feels practical, not mystical, because you literally change the impression your inner mind casts upon the unfolding world. This is how freedom is declared, for the ability to revise the past releases you from the chains of events once thought unchangeable. This is why the technique continues to captivate, as anyone can test it immediately with consistent, conscious imagination. This is how the unseen law asserts itself, bending facts to conform to the state now held internally. This is where empowerment crystallizes, because no one else can revoke your revisions. They exist solely in your domain of consciousness. This is how persistence proves essential, for sporadic imagination produces weak or inconsistent results, while steady revision reshapes life with authority. This is why Neville called the process both simple and profound, a direct line to the creative power within. This is how the mind's dominion becomes clear, as outer circumstances no longer feel arbitrary or cruel, but reflective of your inner choices. This is where the proof becomes undeniable, as repeated practice shows that changing the inner automatically changes the outer. This is how revision cements belief in consciousness as the true reality, demonstrating with vivid clarity that the unseen state is what governs all visible form. Envision a world where every thought, every assumption, every whispered desire is a seed planted in the fertile soil of your consciousness, destined to bear fruit in the outer world according to its inner nature. This is how Neville Goddard reveals the law, teaching that what you cultivate mentally will inevitably manifest physically, provided you tend it with attention and faith. This is where the pattern emerges, because life's conditions are not random, but the harvest of countless seeds sown unconsciously or consciously over time. This is how the truth clarifies, showing that every joy, setback, or encounter is the natural consequence of the inner seeds you have planted and nourished. This is why persistence is sacred, for only steady attention and imaginative alignment ensures the seeds grow into the harvest you desire, rather than the harvest you fear. This is how the unseen garden flourishes, as the mind's invisible cultivation produces visible outcomes with precision and inevitability. This is where accountability awakens, because no external event or person can thwart a seed faithfully nurtured within your imagination. This is how creation gains structure, revealing that life is not chaotic but governed by a consistent law linking cause and effect through consciousness. This is why Neville urged careful observation of your inner world, because neglected assumptions bear fruit as uninvited consequences. This is how freedom grows, for understanding the seed and harvest principle places the power of life squarely in your hands. This is where skill develops, as you learn to plant deliberately, assuming desired outcomes with emotional conviction until they germinate unseen. This is how the miraculous feels natural, for the same law that governs trees and crops governs the realities of wealth, love, and opportunity. This is why every inner act matters, no matter how subtle, because even fleeting thoughts send ripples into the future. This is how alignment becomes a discipline, nurturing seeds of faith, love, and creativity while uprooting the weeds of fear and doubt. This is where anticipation sharpens, for each day's thoughts are gardeners preparing the harvest of tomorrow. This is how responsibility strengthens, as you understand that every visible result was first sown invisibly within. This is why Neville's teaching inspires awe, for it frames life as a precise science of inner cultivation rather than a game of chance. This is how hope becomes active, because planting seeds consciously allows you to claim the future you desire. This is where the law manifests elegantly, showing that patience, persistence, and imagination together produce tangible reality. This is how the principle closes, cementing the understanding that the outer world is simply the harvest of what has been faithfully imagined and assumed within. Picture for a moment the tremendous authority you hold, for Neville Goddard declared that assumption is not a passive thought, but the sovereign law of creation, shaping reality silently, yet inevitably. This is how the principle strikes, because what you assume inwardly, your state, your identity, your desires, casts a shadow that the outer world cannot resist. This is where clarity sharpens, as you realize that to assume a state is to plant a seed so potent that circumstances must conform. This is how mastery unfolds, for persistent assumption eliminates struggle, bending life effortlessly toward the imagined end. This is why Neville urged students to live in the end, for the assumption of fulfillment must feel complete, not tentative or partial. This is how power asserts itself, because the outer world cannot withstand the magnetic certainty of a fully assumed inner reality. This is where doubt threatens, whispering that appearances contradict your assumption, yet Neville insisted the unseen is always truer than the seen. This is how discipline strengthens, because assumption must be sustained with unwavering attention until it crystallizes into fact. This is why imagination becomes law, where an assumed state functions as the blueprint for the unfolding world. This is how the mind governs, directing circumstances to align with the inner command of belief. This is where courage deepens, as the student learns to trust in a reality unseen and resist surrendering to immediate evidence. This is how transformation accelerates, because life reshapes itself in perfect accord with sustained assumption. This is why persistence is sacred, for half-hearted assumption produces only half-hearted results, while full assumption yields undeniable manifestation. This is how the inner authority triumphs, showing that events and people respond like obedient reflections to your assumed state. This is where the invisible scaffolding becomes evident, for each situation, relationship, and opportunity is a reflection of the inner assumption. This is how Neville's teaching feels revolutionary, giving you the practical key to create deliberately rather than react helplessly. This is why the student's imagination becomes a sovereign, guiding every outer circumstance with quiet authority. This is how the law of assumption demonstrates its impartiality, faithfully translating inner certainty into outer fact. This is where the chapter closes, revealing that assumption is not wishful thinking, but the active principle of creation, silently commanding the world to reflect what has been fully embraced within. This is how the student steps into mastery, armed with the understanding that the world is but the mirror of inner assumption. Envision a world where everything you encounter, every person, event, and circumstance, is a reflection of the state of your own consciousness, perfectly mirroring what you hold within. This is how Neville Goddard reveals the startling truth, because the outer world, with all its apparent randomness, is nothing more than a faithful echo of your inner assumptions. This is where perception transforms, as you begin to see that complaints, frustrations, and disappointments are not external punishments, but reflections of neglected or unacknowledged states inside. This is how clarity sharpens, because once you recognize the mirror, you realize changing the reflection requires no battle outside, only a shift within. This is why the teaching feels radical, for it overturns the common notion that life happens to you rather than through you. This is how freedom emerges, as you grasp that no one and nothing outside has the power to dictate your reality except what you allow internally. This is where responsibility asserts itself, because if the world mirrors your inner state, then you are the ultimate author of every condition you experience. This is how the law operates, quietly translating inner moods, beliefs, and assumptions into outer events with precision. This is why attention is sacred, because every inner thought, feeling, or belief acts like a lens shaping the reflection you encounter. This is how mastery begins, as you deliberately cultivate the states you wish to see mirrored, observing with care what your consciousness projects. This is where patience becomes essential, because the mirror obeys steadily and accurately, though changes may unfold over time. This is how the student of Neville learns to revise, reimagine, and assume the desired inner state, confident that the mirror will adjust accordingly. This is why the outer world loses power, as you realize it is not the driver, but the driven, responsive to your inner authority. This is how the unseen dialogue between imagination and appearance becomes evident, revealing that all experiences are invitations to consciousness. This is where transformation feels inevitable, because consistent inner work produces a flawless outer echo. This is how Neville's brilliance illuminates, showing that the world is obedient, patient, and precise, always reflecting the inner life you maintain. This is why hope becomes actionable. For when the inner state is deliberately chosen, the outer cannot resist alignment. This is how the mirror principle empowers, because it turns every encounter into feedback, guiding you to refine consciousness. This is where doubt fades, as repeated proof of life's reflective nature convinces the mind of its own creative sovereignty. This is how the teaching crescendos, showing that by mastering the mirror, you wield the tools to orchestrate your reality with subtlety, precision, and grace. Now consider this. What if time as you know it is not linear but a flowing reflection of states within consciousness, where past, present, and future exist simultaneously and are accessible through imagination? This is how Neville Goddard dismantles conventional thinking, showing that the mind can reach into the future, assume a state already fulfilled, and bring it into present experience. This is where perception expands, because the so-called past is not fixed, but a memory that can be revised, and the future is not predestined but a canvas awaiting the brush of imagination. This is how freedom deepens, for you realize that events are not bound by chronological order, but unfold according to the states you occupy internally. This is why Neville insisted that living in the end is not fantasy but mastery over time, collapsing sequences so that desired realities appear effortlessly. This is how the unseen orchestrates the seen, as consciousness reaches across what you call moments to manifest the state it holds without waiting. This is where fear loses grip, because understanding time as fluid removes the tyranny of too late or too early. This is how creation becomes deliberate, as you learn to occupy the future as fully as the present, calling it into manifestation. This is why the imagination is supreme, for it can leap timelines, weaving events to correspond with the assumed state of consciousness. This is how the law of assumption proves itself, not bound by temporal limitations, but eternally active, translating inner certainty into realized fact. This is where responsibility becomes palpable, because every assumption planted today can alter outcomes across yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This is how miracles appear, when the ordinary flow of time bends to accommodate the imagination that refuses to wait. This is why persistence matters, for continuous assumption anchors the desired state in the present, inviting its manifestation across all apparent moments. This is how consciousness asserts dominance over chronology, proving that reality is an unfolding of inner states rather than external sequences. This is where the student awakens, seeing life as a canvas, where the brush of imagination paints past, present, and future simultaneously. This is how Neville's teaching liberates, because it removes the tyranny of waiting and embraces the power of living in the end. This is why the inner world becomes primary, as temporal limitations dissolve and the unseen law operates freely. This is how control over reality is restored, for time is no longer a master but a servant of consciousness. This is where transformation accelerates, as the linear concept of struggle fades before the immediacy of assumed states. This is how the story of time and consciousness crescendos, revealing that mastery of inner states is mastery over all apparent chronology, and the world must conform to the vision held within. Envision a world where every possibility you can imagine exists simultaneously, a vast inner multiverse waiting for your consciousness to select which reality to inhabit. And Neville Goddard taught that your imagination is the key to navigating these endless realms. This is how the revelation expands, because each choice, each assumption, each state you occupy opens a doorway into a branch of reality previously dormant. This is where perception awakens, as you begin to sense that limitation is an illusion, and every potential outcome is alive, waiting for recognition. This is how freedom magnifies, for the multiverse is not external but embedded within, and your inner focus determines which thread becomes dominant in your experience. This is why Neville emphasized the inner world first, because to master reality externally, you must choose deliberately among the infinite inner possibilities. This is how the unseen theater operates, as consciousness weaves the multiverse into a coherent reflection based on the state you assume. This is where courage is demanded, for deciding which reality to inhabit requires trust in your own creative authority. This is how imagination becomes sovereign, for it not only envisions outcomes, but calls forth the branch of reality that corresponds to its vision. This is why the law of assumption is unstoppable, because the universe is inherently pliable, always reflecting the chosen state of mind. This is how responsibility sharpens, as every fleeting thought is a vote cast for a particular path within the multiverse. This is where alignment proves its potency, for consistent assumption guides events to fall into place as if the world were anticipating your inner state. This is how mastery emerges, as you learn to dwell in the chosen possibility with feeling, conviction, and persistence. This is why revision becomes a powerful tool, for even past disappointments can be redirected into alternate realities by imaginative intervention. This is how the inner compass points true, showing you that the world you experience is the outer echo of the inner choice you have made. This is where patience blends with precision, as the multiverse responds to subtle yet unwavering signals from consciousness. This is how the law of consciousness demonstrates its infinite scope, bending probabilities and aligning circumstances with the preferred internal state. This is why Neville's teaching feels both mystical and practical, because the multiverse exists not in speculation, but as a living, navigable terrain within. This is how the student learns to inhabit the reality they desire, fully and confidently, until the outer world conforms. This is where empowerment solidifies, for every decision, every imagination, every inner focus has the capacity to shape the branch of reality you now experience. This is how the story of the multiverse within crescendos, revealing that your inner selections are the invisible architects of every visible world. Ask yourself what it means to recognize that the I am within you, the awareness that silently observes, imagines, and persists, is not merely human but divine, the very essence Neville Goddard equated with God himself. This is how the revelation strikes, because it places ultimate creative authority squarely within your own consciousness, removing any dependency on external deities or circumstances. This is where empowerment ignites, for once you realize the self is God, every act of imagination becomes an act of divine creation. This is how responsibility crystallizes, because to claim the power of I am is to accept full accountability for every experience you manifest. This is why Neville insisted that the inner state dictates the outer world, for God works through your consciousness, not outside it. This is how mastery emerges, as every assumption, thought, and inner conviction is understood as the instrument of creation. This is where fear falters, because recognizing the divinity within renders external threats powerless. This is how imagination becomes holy, transforming ordinary desires into sacred acts of creation, guided by the self as God. This is why persistence is necessary, for divine authority must be exercised consistently to produce visible manifestations. This is how the law proves itself, as the outer world bends seamlessly to match the inner God consciousness. This is where freedom blossoms, because once you claim the I am, no circumstance can resist your inner authority. This is how the invisible scaffolding of reality is revealed, showing that all forms and events are extensions of your own divine imagination. This is why doubt diminishes, for repeated inner application proves the self operates with infallible precision. This is how transformation accelerates, as every alignment with the I am amplifies the creative potency within. This is where courage solidifies, because acting from the awareness of divinity removes hesitation and empowers decisive inner living. This is how the mystical becomes practical, for everyday reality obeys the assumptions made by the God-conscious self. This is why Neville's teaching resonates, offering a roadmap to wield the inner divine force with conscious intent. This is how the student ascends, understanding that to inhabit the role of God within is to wield ultimate creative authority. This is where the journey intensifies, calling for disciplined assumption, vivid imagination, and persistent inner attention. This is how the chapter closes, revealing that the self is not separate from God, but the very presence of God within, and all reality flows from this central truth. Picture for a moment taking Neville Goddard's profound insights from theory into everyday life, applying the law of consciousness with deliberate focus, and observing how reality shifts in response. This is how the method comes alive, because imagination, assumption, and persistence are no longer abstract ideas, but actionable tools shaping your daily experience. This is where clarity sharpens, as you learn to identify inner states that produce unwanted outcomes and replace them consciously with desired states. This is how mastery begins, for deliberate inner work transforms simple thoughts into tangible results, whether in relationships, health, or finances. This is why Neville emphasized living as if, for embodying the end state internally produces a natural flow of external circumstances in alignment. This is how revision becomes practical, allowing you to rewrite past memories, correct inner impressions, and redirect the momentum of consciousness. This is where attention proves crucial, because every thought, feeling, and assumption acts as a signal to the creative law governing reality. This is how persistence manifests results, for steady adherence to imagined states produces outcomes more reliably than frantic action. This is why inner awareness is sacred, for it guides every choice, action, and response to align with the assumed state. This is how ordinary life transforms into a laboratory of conscious creation, where each moment becomes an experiment in imagination. This is where courage strengthens, because acting from inner authority requires resisting outer appearances that contradict the desired state. This is how the law demonstrates precision, as each sustained assumption eventually produces its corresponding outer reflection. This is why deliberate practice is essential, for sporadic effort yields partial or inconsistent outcomes. This is how the mind's focus becomes a compass, directing events effortlessly to align with inner conviction. This is where empowerment solidifies, as the practitioner realizes they need no external validation to create desired results. This is how Neville's guidance feels alive, for it transforms abstract spiritual principles into methods anyone can apply with consistent attention. This is why experimentation is encouraged, allowing the student to test assumptions, refine techniques, and witness reality bend. This is how the invisible becomes tangible, as imagined states crystallize into external proof. This is where transformation accelerates, because each successful application reinforces faith, persistence, and mastery over consciousness. This is how practical application bridges philosophy and life, showing that the law of consciousness is not only true, but immediately usable in every facet of existence. Think of the moment when doubt, fear, and disbelief rise like walls in your mind, whispering that the world cannot possibly obey your inner assumptions. And Neville Goddard teaches that these are the very illusions you must overcome to claim mastery. This is how resistance is recognized, because the outer world seems to contradict your inner state, tempting you to surrender to appearances. This is where the struggle sharpens, for the mind clings to evidence and logic, while the law of consciousness operates beyond such limitations. This is how persistence proves essential, as continued assumption in the face of apparent contradiction builds unshakable faith. This is why Neville emphasized the feeling of the wish fulfilled, because the emotional conviction behind your assumption dissolves resistance over time. This is how awareness illuminates, showing that every obstacle is temporary, arising only to test the strength of your inner state. This is where courage is forged, because choosing to persist despite appearances transforms doubt into proof of creative power. This is how imagination becomes armor, protecting your inner state from the assault of external facts. This is why vigilance is necessary, for even fleeting moments of inner contradiction can weaken the signal of your assumed state. This is how the law asserts itself, quietly bending reality to match persistent inner conviction, regardless of outer opposition. This is where patience intertwines with strategy, as steady mental discipline neutralizes fear and uncertainty. This is how Neville guides the student, urging them to ignore contradictions, to assume the end and persist, allowing the outer world to follow naturally. This is why resistance is a gift, revealing precisely where your focus and faith need strengthening. This is how mastery grows, because each victory over inner doubt amplifies the power of assumption. This is where freedom deepens, as external resistance loses its grip and outer events conform to your inner reality. This is how the unseen scaffolding becomes evident, showing that persistence in consciousness is stronger than transient appearances. This is why the path of creation is both challenging and exhilarating, requiring discipline, focus, and unwavering faith. This is how obstacles dissolve, as persistent inner assumption reshapes circumstances without conflict. This is where Neville's teaching inspires awe, revealing that the power to overcome resistance is embedded in the very structure of consciousness itself. This is how the chapter concludes, showing that every form of outer opposition can be neutralized by steadfast inner vision, persistence, and faith. Picture for a moment wrapping every imagined state, every assumed desire, and every inner victory in the warmth of gratitude. And Neville Goddard insisted that this atmosphere accelerates manifestation and aligns consciousness with creation. This is how the principle glows, because gratitude magnifies the assumed state, infusing it with emotional power that compels reality to conform. This is where the subtlety reveals itself, for the feeling of having already received strengthens the inner signal more than any mental effort alone. This is how faith becomes tangible, as appreciation turns imagination into a living, vibrating force. This is why Neville emphasized living as though, in the end, because gratitude cements the state as already accomplished, eliminating inner resistance. This is how energy flows, as the heart and mind synchronize in a coherent state that outer circumstances cannot resist. This is where joy amplifies creation, for a grateful inner stance resonates with the law, calling forth corresponding experiences. This is how persistence is sweetened, because gratitude maintains focus without strain, transforming inner work into pleasure rather than struggle. This is why the outer world shifts more easily, as the vibrational harmony of gratitude draws circumstances into alignment effortlessly. This is how the invisible scaffolding strengthens, each thankful thought reinforcing the architecture of assumed reality. This is where confidence blossoms, because appreciation creates a sense of inevitability, removing doubt from the field of consciousness. This is how miracles appear ordinary, as gratitude lubricates the process by dissolving friction between inner desire and outer manifestation. This is why Neville's students reported rapid shifts when cultivating thankfulness alongside assumption, observing events bend almost magically. This is how the law proves itself, as persistent gratitude harmonizes the unseen energies that shape reality. This is where the inner world becomes radiant, a fertile garden where imagination, assumption, and persistence thrive. This is how freedom is experienced, as the mind no longer struggles but celebrates the inevitable fruition of its inner state. This is why every moment of appreciation matters, for it strengthens the signal and hastens the harvest. This is how inner work becomes artful, blending imagination, feeling, and gratitude into a seamless creative process. This is where Neville's teaching culminates in elegance, showing that gratitude is not merely courtesy, but a vital force that activates the law of consciousness. This is how the chapter closes, revealing that the atmosphere of gratitude transforms every inner assumption into a living, manifesting reality. Envision a world where every person, event, and circumstance is not separate from you, but intimately woven into a single tapestry of consciousness. And Neville Goddard insisted that understanding this unity is the key to mastery. This is how the perspective expands, because recognizing the interconnectedness of all things dissolves conflict and reveals that outer resistance is only a reflection of inner discord. This is where empathy deepens, as you see that every individual is a mirror of consciousness expressing its own assumptions and states. This is how responsibility matures. For the realization of unity means every act of imagination, every shift of state, ripples outward, influencing the collective reflection. This is why Neville emphasized the law of consciousness, because creation is not isolated, it vibrates through all things, linking inner states to the totality of experience. This is how awareness strengthens, showing that the outer world and the multiverse within are not two, but one continuous flow of perception and response. This is where freedom harmonizes, as understanding unity removes the illusion of separation, empowering the student to act decisively without attachment to outer resistance. This is how the law proves impartial, faithfully reflecting the dominant state of consciousness across the web of existence. This is why imagination becomes sacred, for every inner assumption contributes to the collective reality, shaping outcomes far beyond individual perception. This is how mastery unfolds, revealing that by aligning your inner state with love, faith, and persistence, you participate consciously in the orchestration of reality. This is where patience grows, for understanding unity requires observing how shifts within echo through myriad unseen channels before manifesting externally. This is how the inner world harmonizes with the outer, demonstrating that every individual assumption resonates within the infinite field of consciousness. This is why the teaching inspires awe, because you realize that no act of imagination is small. Every thought carries the weight of creation itself. This is how empowerment crystallizes, as the student grasps that influencing their inner state contributes to the greater whole. This is where fear dissolves, for separation is revealed as an illusion, and harmony becomes the natural consequence of aligned inner states. This is how compassion and intention converge, showing that mastery is inseparable from awareness of the unity of all things. This is why the student learns to cultivate inner peace, faith, and persistence, knowing the ripple effects extend beyond the self. This is how the law of consciousness asserts itself universally, reflecting the totality of inner life across every facet of existence. This is where the chapter concludes, revealing that mastery is not mere personal gain, but conscious participation in the unified flow of life. This is how the ultimate secret emerges. The self and the universe are one, and the inner state of consciousness is the true source of all reality. Envision a world where the fabric of all that appears, the mountains, oceans, cities, and people, is nothing more than the reflection of consciousness. And Neville Goddard insisted, this is the ultimate truth behind every experience. This is how the revelation crystallizes, for the outer world, with all its complexity and seeming permanence, is subordinate to the inner realm of imagination, assumption, and feeling. This is where clarity pierces, because understanding that consciousness is the true reality empowers you to shape life effortlessly, bypassing struggle and resistance. This is how mastery becomes possible, as every outer circumstance aligns with the dominant state of mind held within. This is why Neville emphasized, living in the end, for the state already realized in consciousness must inevitably manifest externally. This is how the unseen becomes the foundation, revealing that all matter, events, and relationships are consequences, not causes of inner states. This is where freedom deepens, because external conditions are no longer threats but mirrors reflecting your inner world. This is how the law asserts itself perfectly, translating imagination into fact with unfailing precision. This is why persistence is sacred, for steady assumption and feeling secure, the outer manifestation without struggle. This is how the multiverse within obeys, bending probabilities, aligning events, and orchestrating encounters according to the chosen inner state. This is where empowerment solidifies, as every thought, emotion, and imagination becomes an instrument of creation. This is how revision, faith, gratitude, and assumption converge, forming a complete methodology for consciously directing reality. This is why resistance fades, for recognizing consciousness as the ultimate reality removes fear of circumstances, loss, or opposition. This is how unity resonates, showing that the self, the world, and all possibilities are one, and nothing exists outside the law of consciousness. This is where miracles feel ordinary, because they are the natural outcome of deliberate, persistent inner work. This is how understanding flows into action, as daily living becomes a continuous practice of aligning inner state with desired experience. This is why Neville's teaching endures, offering a map to navigate life through consciousness, rather than reacting to appearances. This is how imagination is crowned, not as fantasy, but as the governing principle of reality itself. This is where the story closes, revealing that the only true reality is consciousness, and by mastering it, you become the deliberate creator of all that appears. This is how the cinematic truth of Neville Goddard's teachings culminates, leaving you with the understanding that everything seen is born of the unseen, and the power to shape it lies entirely within.